I'd like to thank Transform for inviting me. I have long admired their work, and Stuart Cohen and Ann Chang have inspired me to do some of my own work. Some of you may remember from your college days that professors come in two types. I don't mean the liberals and the conservatives or the men and the women. I mean the cats and the dogs. The dogs run around in packs, they bark a lot, and each one wants to become the top dog. But the cats are different. They like to mark territory as their own, so the other cats will stay out. And then among the professors of transportation planning, all the dogs chase after moving cars. Ride around in the cars with their heads hanging out the windows, excited by speed. But the cats don't like riding around in cars, and they never hang their heads out the windows. And they hate taking long trips strapped to the roof of a car. Instead, cats inspect all of the parked cars, and they mark the tires. They enjoy sleeping on the hood of a newly parked car while the engine is still warm, and they use this time to brood about the economics of parking. For those engineers, cats call this time a hot soak. Well, cars are parked 95% of the time, so while the dogs chase after the cars during the 5% of the time that they're moving, I thought I could find out something important about the much longer time that their cars are at rest. After all, in an audience of this size, some of you were probably even conceived in a parked car. I was pleased to learn that I've become a parking rock star, although I know this is not the same as a real rock star. Although I have been thinking of changing my name to Shoup Dog. I was happy to be called the Yoda of urban planning until I remembered from my Star Wars days that Yoda was 800 years old. I think it's embarrassing for somebody from Los Angeles to come to the Bay Area to give advice about anything. But here's a picture of Silicon Valley, which shows that it's not just people in Southern California that are fixated on cars. This was a photo that Stuart Cohen took from an airplane, and I've used it many times since. So thank you for that. But a lot of America looks like this view of Silicon Valley, and we tend to ignore this asphalt jungle, especially when we're parked free in it, as all of these cars are on a weekday afternoon. But parking is free to us only in our role as a motorist. We pay for this parking in almost every other role we have in life, as a taxpayer, as an investor, as an employer, as a commuter, as a shopper, as a renter, as a homeowner. The cost of parking does not cease to exist just because the motorist doesn't pay for it. And this pattern goes on for a long way in San Jose. So it's odd, in the high-tech capital of the world, there's no technology whatever used in this parking. There's no occupancy sensing or high-tech metering or license plate recognition. Well, how did it happen? Well, I'm afraid it happened largely because of urban planning. Here's the cover of a book on that planners could go to if they want to know what the parking requirements ought to be. And if this is the picture that the APA puts on the cover of this book, you can see they have a similar fixation on the parking. But it doesn't say call parking standards. It says nothing about standards. Standards sound like a good thing. It just says what the parking requirements are on a sample of cities. And when you look at the parking requirements in San Jose or Santa Rosa, they look sensible until you begin seeing a whole lot of them. That they're sort of sensible if you relate it to the number of people. There's always more than at least one parking space per person. Well, maybe there's a barber and somebody waiting, well, somebody in the chair waiting. And there's often a gender distinction that's hard to understand. Almost every land use requires more than one space per person, except religious uses, and even then there's a gender distinction. But once you get away from the number of people, it's hard to know, and largely based on the number of square feet. But if you don't have square feet, then you have to base it on something else. And if you were a planner and you were asked to set the parking requirement for a gas station, what would you do? Well, you would look at the parking standards and say, well, this is what some cities do. It always has to be based on something so that the development can go ahead with the required parking, even in the afterlife. Well, I think we made two big mistakes in our parking policy, is to keep the curb parking free or cheap and require lots of off-street parking. Here's the parking requirements in San Jose. The green is the size of the building and the red is the size of the parking lot. And you can see that in most cases the city requires more space for parking than for the building itself. When you look at the individually, just one city's requirements, it looks like a lot of thought went into this. It's very elaborate. It's really down to very fine sets of numbers. It looks scientific, but it's not. It has the air of science, but it's just pseudo-science. But it isn't just San Jose that has a lot of parking. Here's an aerial view of where we are now. The price of this parking lot right on top of the subway stop, which would never happen in most cities, to have a parking lot, $2 a day on top of a subway station. I mean, after you spent billions of dollars to build a subway station, it looks like a good place for transit-oriented development. Here's something, somebody sent me an email a few days ago. What is the benefit of this? And I talk to people and they say, yes, they do that. The teachers who teach downtown do it. It's a cheap parking lot for to ride one stop. We do have municipal parking garages, but apparently Berkeley didn't have enough money to use the spell check when they put up that sign. And you've had trouble keeping the heads on parking meters, and the planners in Berkeley must be very intelligent to know exactly how many minutes we need to park where we go. Well, I think that the problem with these parking requirements is that planners know next to nothing about the effects of them. Obviously, they don't know how much the spaces cost because it varies enormously from one building to the next. Or how much the required parking spaces increase the cost of everything, or how they affect the urban design, because often the parking is the ugliest part of any building, or whether they increase congestion or air pollution, or now we're worried about CO2 emissions, and they have no training. No planner could ever say that they have any training in how to set a planning requirement. Planners are winging it. It's a political talent, not an analytic device. And I think it has intruded, it turned what should be an investment decision into a government decision. It's the opposite of privatization, inappropriate governmentalizing of a private decision. So I recommend three reforms. Charge the right price for curb parking. Who could object to that? It's a tautology. But by that I mean the lowest price that would leave one or two open spaces on each block. Some cities call this performance parking pricing. And then to make this politically popular is to spend the meter revenue on visible public services on the metered streets. And I'll get back to that. When the residents can see their meter money at work on their block, then they will say, I see what you mean. And then when you do that, you can reduce the off-street parking requirements. That will remove a lot of the damage being done. Well, Berkeley is trying these performance parking prices. They're sort of lean version of what SF Park does. They don't vary by the time of day, but they're trying to adjust them so that with the same price all day long, they get something reasonable. about 85% occupancy, and one curb space everywhere. And San Francisco started this, and they had a federal grant which allowed them to get some really nice graphics saying the problem we have is that some blocks are overcrowded and some are undercrowded. So if we just nudged up the price on the top block and nudged it down on the bottom block, maybe we'll get this. And some people say, well, gee, changing prices by time of day from block to block, you know, that's like social change that is too much for us. It's like the Reformation or Prohibition. You know? But is moving one car from one block to another too much for us? Are we incapable of doing that as a society? I think a small change can lead to a big result. And San Francisco has been doing it. I won't talk that much about it because you probably know more than I do. But we did look at two parallel blocks in the Mission District that started out at the same price at the beginning of SF Park, and you can see that Chestnut was overcrowded and Lombard was undercrowded, and they began, as you can see, the prices are on the dot at each line. You can see the prices started going up on Chestnut and started going down on Lombard. It took a while to happen, but eventually Bow Street started out at $2 an hour, and the average price on Lombard fell by 50%, and it rose on Chestnut by 75%. That's what it took to get there. You know, one block away. But it got both blocks at the right occupancy rate. And the number of blocks, I think they have 7,000 meters. It took a while for the green line is the share of the blocks that are in the right occupancy rate. As you can see, it took about a year before it began moving. But look how at the end, it ended up about what, 72% of the blocks were in the right occupancy rate. It takes some patience. It isn't overnight. It's not a plug-and-play operation. You have to work on it. And I hope you can see this. You need a binocular at the back. But you can see the prices are very different from one block to another. Even around the corner. You know, how could it be $4 on one block and 50 cents on another block so close to each other? That's something that no planner could tell you. You just have to let the market tell you what happened. Some reporters would always call me at these price changes and say, well, won't this confuse people if we have different prices at different blocks? And I say, well, if the block is half empty, do you think they should not reduce the price? And most people say, yes. Well, if it's full, then don't you think they should nudge it up? Well, yes. And that's all they were doing, is responding to what they saw on the street. Now, some people objected to this and tried to, yes?
Just a quick question. On both streets, they could park for the same, they can park for 3 hours?
The same 5 blocks of those two. The vertical blocks are also priced at different prices. So they're that different. Answer Coalition, it's an organization here in Northern California, tried to stop the parking meter hike and say it's unfair to businesses. And of course, on the other side of the Spanish, it looked even more threatening with more than all the exclamation points. Now, the Answer Coalition is opposed what is it? The Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. They're against foreign wars for oil, but they want free parking at home. I think that they say it's going to hurt poor people, but 30% of the population in San Francisco don't own a car, so they're not going to be affected at all. They ride the bus, which is mired in traffic caused by people circling for parking spaces in cars owned by richer people. So I think it's ridiculous to say that on balance, charging for parking and spending all the money in San Francisco to spend on subsidizing transit. So to think that this is hurting the poor, I think is a bad idea. Policies that subsidize cars over all the alternatives are not a good way to help poor people. Free parking for everybody reduces public revenues and therefore public services. Poor people are less able to substitute private services for public services. They can't have a backyard instead of a public park. They can't send their kids to private schools rather than public schools. So cities have a limited amount of money to spend on helping poor people. It's subsidized parking for everybody. The best way to spend this money when many poor people don't own a car. And most rich people have several cars. So I think if you have some money to help poor people, spending it to provide parking for everybody is not the best way to help them. I was speaking in a city focus group today about whether you should run the meters after 6 p.m. And you always hear the argument it'll hurt poor people if we run the meters, needing the waiters and people, low-income people who need parking. The meters cease operating at 6 p.m. here. Whenever I go to a restaurant, anywhere with meters, and I've happened at the old Beckett restaurant here, I have to wait where do you park? And they always tell me, I try to get here around 5 so I can get a meter space, then I get the meter all evening long. So they're taking a space which could be used by customers, and I think that they're losing tips by taking spaces that could be for customers. Now, some people think this is difficult to do because the meters are, how can you have different prices at different times of day? Well, they think that the meters are like, this is the first meter installed in the United States in 1935, and most meters are just the same. You put your money in and you hope to get back before the meter runs out. Well, newer meters are much more sophisticated than this, and most of them, I'm afraid, are imported. And these high-tech meters are very common in other countries. They can charge different prices at different times of day, and they can take credit cards, and they can speak to you in different languages. Here's one on the UCLA campus. It doesn't tell you what the price of parking is until you touch a button, any button, and then it tells you the price at that time of day. Now, it seems like a lot of money to charge on a university campus. It's $3 for the first hour and $4 for the second hour. Is that too much to charge for parking? Well, some of you probably realize that professors have a lot of spare time on their hands. So I set up my camera across from this parking meter. There are eight vehicles, and that's about the average number of parking spaces on a block, parallel parking. So I took a picture every 4 minutes to show what happened on this block. You can see that's about the ideal picture you want to see. If you have a restaurant or a store or anything, the parking is well used but readily available. And so I took a picture every 4 minutes. You'll see the shadows move. There's 4 minutes later. You see the cars come and they go. The two at the end never moved. But cars, you always see people paying at the meters as well. You can see that sometimes there was more than one. It can be filled up. So, do you think the parking works as well in your city? If you set up your camera at any block in your city and took a picture every 4 minutes, do you think it would look anything like that? No, I don't think so. Except maybe in San Francisco, on Lombard or Chestnut. So how do you get that to happen? It's not always one open space, but it's usually one open space. Some drivers, especially here in Northern California, think they have good parking karma. That's sort of a God-given ability to find the space right where they want it. So obviously, some people by chance have that, but I think that this would give everybody parking karma if we had this. So what is the right price? UCLA should be higher. Well, then a lot of the spaces would be underused. If this was a business area, the stores would be losing customers. Should it be lower? You could have one more car parked, but those cars wouldn't move often, and there'd be a lot of cruising. So I think this is the Goldilocks principle, parking prices. Not too high, not too low. It's just right. It's like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. I know it when I see it. The only way to tell whether the price is right is to look at what happens. And that's all it takes. There's no analysis, there's no modeling, there's no nothing. It's just paying attention to what you see on the street. And you do want to to set the right price so that a lot of cars aren't driving around in circles. It's even worse in New York. Here's this staying, I have the second life going around as an itinerant parking preacher, but the cost of the hotel, including the taxes, the off-street parking was $20 an hour and the curb it was $1 an hour. Well, doesn't that create the incentive for cruise? Isn't the city telling you that you should cruise? How long would you be willing to cruise if you were faced between the choice of paying $20 or $1? How much is your time really worth? Well, there have been studies of this starting back in 1927. Appropriately, the first one was done in Detroit. And on average, I think they found that where they looked, and this is on 4 continents over 80 years, they found that I think about 30% of the cars were in the areas where they looked were cruising. One of the first studies was done in Chicago, which I liked, where they hired low-paid students to stand in every corner and take the license plate of every car and where it went so they could recreate the path of travel. And some cars, like on the lower left, were focused on one block. They were obsessed with parking there. And then on the other blocks, people hoped to do experiences and they would try to but it is a frustrating thing to do. It's driving the people who don't want to move. It isn't getting people, we're not trying to get people out of their cars or force them out of their cars. They don't want to be in their car. And this leads to some very dangerous behavior. People see an opening on the other side of the street, they'll make a U-turn in the middle of the block. I've got some grainy footage here, right here in Berkeley earlier today. Whatever it takes to find a curve. How to make it popular? Well, I think that my second reform is to spend the revenue in a very publicly visible way on something that people really want. Because most people, when they put money in their parking meter, politically it disappears. It doesn't seem to do anybody any good. But when people know where the money goes, they understand that it's not un-American to ask you to pay for curb parking. This happens around the LA Coliseum and probably around here in various places. At any big event, this was in the 1984 Olympics, but at any event, the residents park their cars on the street and sell the spaces in the driveway to ticket goers. It happens all over the country in college towns. One of the best examples of this was in Pasadena. It was a commercial skid row. It was a wonderful buildings in terrible condition, most of them empty above the ground floor, and many of them empty on the ground floor. Here's what it looks like now. One of the most popular destinations for tourists in Southern California. 30,000 people go there on the weekend just to walk around. And how did this happen? The city wanted to put in parking meters, the merchants bitterly opposed it, saying we'll chase away the few customers we have, and then the city has offered to return all the meter revenue to pay for public services that they wanted in Pasadena. And the merchants said, well, let's do it now. Let's run the meters till midnight. Let's run it Sunday. And they put the meters in, they get over $1 million a year on, they fixed all the sidewalks and the alleys. They have an advisory board that made up of representatives of the business owners and the landowners. And Marilyn Buchanan is one of the major business leaders there. And she said, when we figured out that the money would stay here, that the money would be used to improve the neighborhood, it was an easy sell. Parking meters went from being bitterly opposed to being an easy sell. And I think that when you look at the before and after, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with motorcycles, but here's years and decades of paint was peeled off, and here's a tire warehouse that had been empty for years that became a department store without any parking. Here's the alleys that had been left, dead animals and mattresses, and now this is what they are. They're a second front door on many areas. They have restaurants in the alleys. It's a wonderful place. So I think that all new street trees, all new historic light fixtures, beautiful sidewalks. They steam clean the sidewalks twice a month. They sweep them every night. They remove graffiti every night. All paid for with parking revenue. So and then my third recommendation is remove parking requirements. That you have these parking benefit districts, that they help to manage transportation, that so Anne won't have to have these dangerous maneuvers. They reduce congestion and air pollution right where there are the most pedestrians, like in downtown Berkeley, where there's so many pedestrians. That's where you have people driving around, polluting the air that I breathe as I walk along the sidewalk. And then it's also an economic development tool. In Pasadena, the sales tax revenue took off after they put in the meters and spent the revenue. It more than tripled. And other parts of Pasadena said, we want this too. Areas that were much higher income, scoffed at old Pasadena, now wanted to copy this. So then I think you could remove the off-street parking requirements, start back with Stuart Cohen's picture. I'd like to end where I began, that zoning requires several homes for every car, but it ignores homeless people. And I think by increasing the cost of housing, parking requirements make the homelessness problem even worse. In city planning, free parking has become more important than affordable housing. How can you get rid of the best work? Now, you might say that's an untypical day. Stuart Cohen takes these pictures to make a point. But now Google has put online historical pictures of what they've been looking at all along. Here's the first I could get, December 2004. That's a Monday, a work day. Google's been keeping track of us for a long time, but we didn't know it. This is just a selection of the photographs. It looks as though some of those spaces had never had a car parked in them. But they're all required. Those buildings are as big as they can be, given the size of the parking lot that they have. So we've got a problem. We've spent a lot of money and wasted it, and given free parking to a lot of people in an area where they said commuting is a nightmare, the air pollution is terrible, the housing is so expensive. What can we do about it? Well, the parking lot itself is quite nice, but you get right down to it. It's well landscaped. Look at the nice mountains in the background. It's a lovely area with a great climate. It's a wonderful place to be if you're a car. Well, suppose, the reason it looks that way is the planners and politicians require it to be that way. The city code, which I showed you, requires that that's what the city looks like. So suppose they said, well, let's get out of the way. They took Transform's advice and say, all right, you can build housing on that area if you want, and you don't have to provide any parking. So I do anything with Photoshop. I took some buildings from London and put them there. I was becoming a Congress for New Urbanism, and they really liked that. And they must have been cleaned because to show off and to say that these are called liner buildings, in New Urbanists speak. You line parking lots with housing or something else, so that as you walk along the street, it looks like a great city. So I thought, well, they wouldn't do that, so then I just took some garden variety apartment houses from Los Angeles, from downtown LA, being the more likely outcome. But it shows how land that is now required to be used for parking could be used for something better. And this is Cisco who owns this, that their employees, instead of commuting for 20 miles, they can walk across the parking lot to work. They wouldn't need as many cars. They wouldn't need a car at work and at home. Some of them would get away maybe with one car or none. And just think, it could be worker housing, it could be market rate housing. If that worked out, they could build some more. It's very incremental. It's a small change if the city planners and the politicians would allow it to happen. That's all it takes. And here's the building in LA. It has shops and on the ground floor and restaurants and You could have any kinds of things. You could have garden apartment buildings there. It needn't be apartment buildings. It could be anything smaller. So I think the solution is right there in the site. If building housing on formerly required parking lots will help to solve a lot of problems. The land is already assembled and ready to go. They're not brown fields. The cars and the fuel are often imported, but apartment houses are made in America. So shifting land from parking to housing will increase employment, but we have to do three things. I think we have to remove the off-street parking requirements and zoning ordinance to make the housing construction possible without parking. We have to charge for curb parking. You'd have to charge for curb parking there to prevent spillover onto the street. If people had to pay for parking in unlevel, if you rent your apartment, if you want a parking space, well, maybe you pay $150 a month, whatever it takes to allocate those spaces. But then you'd have to charge for curb parking. And then third, spend that new parking revenue on neighborhood public services to make this policy very popular. So I think this simple policy, getting out of the way, would solve a lot of the problems that Americans now face. One person describing this policy said that building infill housing on parking lots would be the world's largest land reclamation project outside the Netherlands. We have an unplanned land reserve for housing in the places where we want it most. And I would say that Ashby parking lot is a similar thing. So I think there would be a lot of good effects. I think it would increase employment, which is still a problem. It would certainly increase the housing supply. And because it would be job adjacent, it would reduce the time spent commuting. And we wouldn't have to import so many cars and so much fuel, and we would have less traffic congestion, air pollution. And you can't ignore that it's going to have an effect on the climate. In Northern California, the world headquarters of high-tech things, it would increase the demand for high-tech parking management, license plate recognition, parking sensors, and things like that. So I think that this is not really out of the question. There's a lot of support, depending on your ideology, for different reasons. Whether you're on the left or the right, this has a lot to offer you. Because liberals should like it because it will fund a lot of new public spending and create jobs. And conservatives should like it, I think, it relies on markets rather than government regulation to achieve our goals. Environmentalists should like it because it will reduce energy consumption and carbon emissions, and businesses should see that it will unburden enterprise. It means that government is not governmentalizing, but should be their decision. It's the person who's building and owning the housing should know how much parking spaces to provide, not a planner who never learned one single thing about it in their graduate school. The new urbanists should like it. I think that it would, partly because of urban design, these lighter buildings would make that part of San Jose look a lot better. And we could live at higher density without being overrun by our cars. And I won't let go. I would say that there's a lot of other people should like it for libertarian reasons. Say that it increases individual choice. The developers have a choice, the renters have a choice, the buyers have a choice. It shouldn't be dictated by the government. It shouldn't be coerced by the government. The government should not force up the parking supply. And people who are obsessed with property rights, and they have a lot of reasons to support that idea, say that it reduces regulations on land use. If you really are a supporter of property rights, you should support this idea. Developers are the first person who will tell you it will greatly reduce the building costs and the permitting costs and everything like that. And residents, you can see how old Pasadena changed, and the people who are neighborhood activists will realize that this allows local choices. Say in Pasadena, they have a local commission that decides on how to spend the revenue. So there's a nexus between how the money is spent and what the residents think. And I think the best things about it, we can ask the mayors here, it removes the political burden of setting parking prices. You wouldn't have any more council meetings that last till 3 a.m. on the idea of increasing the price of parking by 25 cents. So I think that we're doing things so wrong. We just have to stop doing these wrong things. And what do? Maybe we won't need quite so many cars as we have now. Here's a suggestion. It's a sculpture in France called the long-term parking. What about all these parking garages that we built? And we're continuing to build. We're tearing down one garage in the middle of Berkeley and building another one because it isn't big enough. Here's one in Holland that they found a useful. I bet that Berkeley students could do this. Well, a planner can't end better than by quoting from Jane Jacobs. We're not a wealthy country because of what you and I have done. We live in a wealthy country because we were born here, and we owe a lot to the past. And I think that we want to have our descendants be proud of what we're doing. I don't think that we are acting like suitable ancestors. And it's partly because of our parking policy. And various people have said the same thing. Dwight Eisenhower, in his farewell address, the famous industrial complex speech, said essentially the same thing. We now seem to be plundering the resources of tomorrow at a rate that President Eisenhower could not have imagined. And that there's no better writer among our presidents than Abraham Lincoln, of course. I think our case is due. We have new technology, we have new problems. Global warming is a great one. And it's time to think anew about parking and to act anew. Now, it's not often that you get a lecture in Berkeley concluding with quotes from 2 Republican presidents. But I think, despite the inertia that we always face in urban planning, I think reforms are sprouting, and Go Berkeley is one of them that will be watched. It is being watched carefully around the country. But I think these paradigm shifts, they're not that difficult, that they're often barely noticeable while they're happening. And I saw survey results that most people have not noticed the changes in parking prices at Berkeley. They don't know that Go Berkeley is happening. And afterward, it's hard to tell that anything has changed. Once you get to a point where you charge fair market prices for car parking and spend the money on public services, people won't know that we did it differently. But I think the parking problem will be with us for a long time. Unless I hear that here in Silicon Valley, they're working on electric cars and all kinds of self-driving cars, and there's one that most of you haven't seen. I think if it works out, it'll solve a lot of our problems. All the cruel parking videos have women as the heroes. I think parking is free for our cars, but or cheap. But housing is expensive for people, and I think we've got our priorities exactly the wrong way around. Cities have made huge mistakes in planning for parking, and I think the next generation of planners can help to correct it. Well, that's about all I know, so I better stop. Thank you to Transform for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.